What lost civilization mystery still hasn't been solved? Story 1. So here's something that should be way more famous than it is. While the Egyptians were building the Great Pyramid at Giza around 2560 BC, there was a civilization on the other side of the world doing something just as impressive. Norte Chico, in present-day Peru, was building massive stone platform mounds, running a complex society, and doing all of this around 3000 BC, roughly the same time as the earliest Mesopotamian city-states and older than anything comparable in the Americas by a significant margin. What makes Norte Chico specifically fascinating is what it didn't have. No pottery, no visual art depicting warfare, no weapons caches in the archaeological record. This is one of the only complex civilizations in history that appears to have organized itself. Large-scale construction, food distribution, trade networks, apparently without the usual toolkit of kings, armies, and coercion that anthropologists assumed were prerequisites for complexity. Their big thing was textiles. They used quipu, knotted string systems that later Andean civilizations also used for record keeping. Whether Norte Chico's quipu was a form of writing or record keeping is genuinely debated. And then, around 1800 BC, they faded. Not dramatically, no single destruction event that archaeology has found. The sites were abandoned over time. The people presumably went somewhere, became someone else, but the specific social experiment of a large civilization, apparently running without warfare or coercive hierarchy, just quietly ended, and we have no idea why. Norte Chico predates the Olmec, the Maya, and the Aztec. It's older than anything else in the Americas by over 1,000 years. Almost nobody outside specialist archaeology knows it existed. Story 2. The Beaker people. Ancient DNA shows they basically replaced most of Britain's population in a few centuries, and we don't know how. Around 2500 BC, something happened in Europe that ancient DNA research has only recently confirmed, and when you sit with what it means, it's genuinely unsettling. A group of people associated with a specific style of pottery, the Bell Beaker culture, spread across Europe from Iberia to the British Isles in a few centuries. That's not unusual. Cultural styles spread all the time. What is unusual is what the DNA shows happened in Britain specifically. The people who were there before, the descendants of the farmers who built Stonehenge, who had been in Britain for over a millennium, were almost entirely replaced genetically within a few generations. By 2000 BC, approximately 90% of the ancestry of people in Britain had changed. The Beaker people's genetics had effectively replaced the previous population. This is one of the most dramatic genetic replacement events ever documented in European prehistory, and archaeologists are still arguing about how it happened. The obvious answer is conquest. The Beaker people invaded and ended or displaced the previous inhabitants. But the archaeological record doesn't clearly show a conquest. There's no layer of burned settlements, no mass graves of battle casualties, no dramatic shift in military technology that would explain how this was accomplished. Other theories: disease brought by the incoming population to which the existing population had no immunity, or gradual social pressure. The Beaker culture may have been associated with status goods and elite networks that made intermarriage with Beaker people desirable, and over generations, the original population's genes were swamped. The people who built Stonehenge were almost entirely gone within a few centuries. Their descendants weren't there anymore. The Beaker people replaced them. We still don't know how. Story 3. If you speak English, Spanish, French, German, Russian, Persian, Hindi, Greek, or any of about 400 other languages, you owe a debt to a group of people who lived on the Eurasian steppe around 3000–2500 BC, the Yamnaya. These were semi-nomadic herders who had horses, wheeled wagons, and apparently an extraordinary capacity for expansion. Almost all Indo-European languages, which cover about half the world's speakers, trace back to the language these people spoke. Ancient DNA research over the last decade has established that the Yamnaya didn't just spread their language through cultural contact. They spread genetically across Europe and into South Asia in a few centuries, replacing large fractions of the existing populations. In some parts of Europe, Yamnaya ancestry represents 50–75% of modern people's genetic heritage. They arrived in the early Bronze Age, and they arrived in massive numbers. The specific puzzle? How did they do this? They didn't have large organized armies as far as anyone can tell from the archaeological record. They had horses and wagons, which gave them mobility advantages. They may have had diseases that devastated sedentary farming populations. They may have arrived during a period when those populations were already stressed by climate change or social disruption. One theory that has attracted significant attention: the Yamnaya may have carried plague, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. Ancient DNA from sites in Europe dated to around this period shows the presence of early Y. pestis strains. If Yamnaya expansion was accompanied by plague among populations with no immunity, that would go a long way toward explaining the genetic replacement. We speak Indo-European languages because of people we didn't know existed until ancient DNA research found them. Story 4: the Olmec are sometimes called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, which is a way of saying that basically everything the Maya, Aztec, and other later civilizations built was heavily influenced by what the Olmec developed first. The long count calendar, the ball game, the concept of divine kingship, the feathered serpent motif. They were doing all of this around 1500–400 BCA, while Europe was still in its Iron Age. Their major city, La Venta, was one of the most important ceremonial centers in the ancient Americas. And then, around 400 BCA, something happened that archaeologists find genuinely strange. La Venta wasn't just abandoned. It was deliberately dismantled. The massive stone monuments, including the famous colossal heads, were intentionally defaced. Their features were partially destroyed. They were buried in specific arrangements. This is not what a city looks like when people leave in a hurry. This looks like something deliberate. A conscious, organized decision to enter these monuments, to deface them, to put them in the ground. What does that mean? Several possibilities. Internal revolution, a new political faction literally burying the old power symbols. Ritual, a planned end of the city's ceremonial life conducted according to specific religious protocols. Invasion, though the specific care of the burial doesn't look like invaders tearing things down. A deliberate termination ritual that we simply don't have the cultural context to understand. The Olmec didn't write in a system we can read. Whatever they thought they were doing at La Venta around 400 BC, whatever the colossal heads meant and why they needed to be buried and damaged, we're reading the physical evidence without the manual. Story 5: the Cascajal Block. The oldest writing in the Americas might be Olmec, or it might not be writing at all. In 1999, workers in the Mexican state of Veracruz found a carved serpentine block during road construction. The block was turned over to researchers, and when archaeologists examined it, they found 62 symbols arranged in rows, a sequence of repeated, apparently structured marks that looked, to some researchers, like writing. If it is writing, the Cascajal block is the oldest writing system in the Americas, predating other Mesoamerican scripts by several centuries, and associated with the Olmec civilization around 900 BC. The symbols appear in sequences with some repeated patterns that would be consistent with a writing system, words or phrases appearing multiple times in structured contexts. The problem is that the symbols don't match anything known from later Mesoamerican scripts. They don't connect to Maya hieroglyphics or Zapotec writing or any other system that developed in the region. If the Olmec invented writing, whatever they were writing was apparently not directly inherited by anyone who came after them. There's a second problem. A significant minority of scholars don't think the Cascajal block represents writing at all. They argue the symbols could be decorative, religious iconography, or some other form of marking that doesn't constitute a writing system in the functional sense. The symbols appear to lack the complexity of distribution that characterizes actual writing. The way some symbols appear frequently and others rarely, the way combinations encode meaning. The debate hasn't been resolved. The block exists. The symbols are there. Whether they record language or something else, whether the Olmec invented writing in the Americas and the knowledge died with their civilization, is still genuinely contested among the specialists who study it. Story 6 in the high desert of New Mexico. The ancestral Puebloans, ancestors of modern Pueblo peoples, built something extraordinary between roughly 850 and 1150 CE. Chaco Canyon contains massive multi-story buildings called Great Houses, the largest of which, Pueblo Bonito, had around 650 rooms. They weren't just big, they were precisely aligned with solar and lunar cycles, roads, dead straight, engineered, running across the desert for miles, connected Chaco to outlying communities across a vast region. The mystery about Chaco is layered. The canyon itself is not great farmland. It doesn't have reliable water. Researchers have found that the timber used in construction was hauled from forests 60 miles away. The great houses may not have been primarily residential. They might have been pilgrimage sites, ceremonial centers, elite compounds. Chaco was apparently the center of something regional, something that extended across hundreds of miles of the Southwest. And then, within a couple of generations around 1150 CE, everyone left. The canyon was abandoned. A long drought is the leading explanation, and the drought was real. But the drought alone doesn't explain the timing precisely, doesn't explain why some communities maintained population while Chaco emptied completely, and doesn't explain why, even when conditions improved, nobody came back. Tree ring data gives us extraordinary precision about the climate. We know there was a drought. We know exactly when Chaco's construction stopped and its population declined. The specific mechanism, why this place specifically, why completely, why no return, doesn't follow cleanly from the climate data alone. The roads are still there. The great houses are still there. The people are gone. Story 7. Most people know the Nazca from the lines, the enormous geoglyphs scraped into the Peruvian desert that depict animals, geometric shapes, and figures visible only from the air. The lines get all the attention. What's actually more interesting, and more instructive for reasons that extend well beyond the ancient past, is how the Nazca society actually ended. The Nazca lived in one of the driest places on Earth. Their desert ecosystem was held together by a specific tree, the huarango. Huarango trees have root systems that go extraordinarily deep, reaching water tables that other plants can't access. Their presence stabilized the soil against erosion. They were part of a delicate system that made agriculture viable in what is otherwise essentially uninhabitable terrain. The Nazca cut them down. Pollen records from the region show a dramatic decline in huarango trees corresponding with Nazca agricultural expansion, replaced with maize and other crops. The trees were cleared for farmland. What happened next was predictable in retrospect. Without the deep roots, the soil became vulnerable to erosion. When El Niño events brought unusually heavy rain, the water that would previously have been absorbed by the root system instead caused catastrophic flooding and debris flows. The agricultural system that depended on the soil stability the trees had provided collapsed. The Nazca are an early documented case of an agricultural civilization causing its own ecological collapse through land management decisions that prioritized short-term production over the underlying system that made production possible. They're not unique in doing this. They may be the most archaeologically clear example of how it happens. Story 8. You've probably heard the Easter Island story. The Rapa Nui people cut down all the trees on their island, caused ecological collapse, their civilization fell apart, and they were left in desperate poverty by the time Europeans arrived. It's been used as a parable for environmental self-destruction for decades, appearing in environmental textbooks and popular science books as the definitive example of a civilization destroying itself. The problem is that this narrative is being significantly revised by recent research, and the revision has uncomfortable implications. The ecocide model was built on the observation that the island had almost no trees when Europeans arrived, and that the population at European contact appeared much smaller than the peak population suggested by archaeological evidence. The model assumed the population had crashed before European contact due to self-inflicted environmental destruction. What newer research argues, the Rapa Nui population may have been relatively stable, not a crashed remnant of a larger one, until European contact. The documented population collapses followed European arrival in 1722, and they followed a familiar pattern: diseases the islanders had no immunity to, and, critically, slave raids. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders abducted approximately 1,500 Rapa Nui people, roughly a third of the island's entire remaining population. Those who were later repatriated brought smallpox back with them. The population collapsed from thousands to around 111 people. The narrative of self-inflicted collapse is tidier and more morally neutral. They did it to themselves. Not anyone else did it to them. Newer evidence suggests the catastrophe came from outside. The parable may be more about how we interpret indigenous collapse than about what actually happened. Story 9: The Hittites were one of the great powers of the Bronze Age, contemporaries of Egypt and Babylon, with a massive empire centered in Anatolia. Their capital city, Hattusa, was a sophisticated urban center with temples, palaces, and an archive of thousands of clay tablets that gave us enormous insight into Bronze Age diplomacy and religion. And then, around 1200 BC, during the broader Bronze Age collapse, the Hittite Empire simply ceased to exist. Hattusa was found burned. The destruction is in the archaeological record: fire damage, collapsed walls, evidence of intense heat. The obvious conclusion: invaders, the Sea Peoples, or other groups destroyed the capital. Except the archaeological layering tells a more complicated story. When researchers examined the destruction layer carefully, they found evidence suggesting the city had been largely abandoned before the fire. There's an absence of the kind of material culture you'd expect to find in a city that was occupied when it was destroyed. Valuables, everyday objects, the accumulated material of daily life. What was found suggested a city that had already been stripped of its contents. The current leading interpretation: the Hittite state collapsed from within, probably from a combination of internal political pressure, disrupted trade networks, food shortages, and the general crisis of the late Bronze Age. The population of Hattusa appears to have left deliberately. Someone, possibly opportunistic raiders, possibly retreating Hittites themselves, then set the empty city on fire. The Hittites disappeared as a political entity within a generation. Their language survived only in fragments. Their capital was burned, but the people may have already been gone. Story 10: The Minoan civilization of ancient Crete gets associated with one of the biggest natural disasters of the ancient world: the eruption of Thera around 1600 BC, one of the most powerful volcanic events in human history. The explosion was so massive it may have generated tsunamis, atmospheric cooling from ash, and agricultural disruption across the eastern Mediterranean. For decades, the standard story was that the Thera eruption destroyed the Minoans. Neat, dramatic, explicable. The problem is that archaeological evidence doesn't support it. Minoan culture continued, building, trading, producing the extraordinary frescoes and palace complexes that make the culture famous. For at least a century and a half after the Thera eruption, there are destruction layers at Minoan sites that post-date Thera significantly. The Minoans survived the eruption. What finished them was the Mycenaeans. The mainland Greek Mycenaean culture, which had been heavily influenced by Minoan civilization, eventually absorbed it. Linear B tablets, the Mycenaean writing system, which we can read, appear in Crete after approximately 1450 BCE, suggesting Mycenaean administrative control of the island. The Minoan Linear A script, which we cannot read, disappears. The Minoans' final decline is still debated in its specifics. Earthquakes, internal revolt, and Mycenaean takeover have all been proposed as contributing factors, and the relative weight of each is argued over. The eruption is not the culprit. or not the primary one. The civilization that may have inspired the Atlantis legend survived a super-volcanic eruption and was eventually absorbed by its Greek neighbors. Story 11, the Etruscans. The civilization that basically created Roman culture just got absorbed, and their language died before Rome was a republic. Before Rome was anything much, the dominant civilization in central Italy was the Etruscans. They ran sophisticated city-states, had a thriving artistic tradition, controlled trade networks across the Mediterranean, and had so much cultural influence on early Rome that the Romans adopted their alphabet, their architectural forms, their religious practices, and aspects of their political vocabulary. The toga, the defining garment of Roman civic life, is Etruscan. And then, Rome grew. And the Etruscans were absorbed. City by city, over several centuries, Etruscan culture was incorporated into Roman culture, not necessarily through conquest. Many Etruscan cities allied with Rome or became Roman through treaty and gradual integration. By the 1st century BC, Etruscan as a living language was essentially gone. The last known inscription in Etruscan dates to around 50 BC. Here's the specifically frustrating part for scholars. We have around 10,000 Etruscan inscriptions. We can read the alphabet. It's related to Greek. We can understand a few hundred words. But we can't actually read Etruscan in any meaningful sense. The language is an isolate, not related to Latin, not related to Greek, not related to anything else known. Short religious inscriptions and funerary texts can be roughly understood. Longer texts remain largely opaque. The Liber Linteus, a linen book, the only surviving linen book from antiquity, is written in Etruscan. We know it's a ritual calendar of some kind. We can't read most of it. The civilization that shaped Rome exists mostly in Roman descriptions of it. Their own voice is almost entirely lost. Story 12, the Indus Valley Massacre that wasn't. One of the largest ancient civilizations just quietly faded out. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called Harappan, was one of the largest urban societies of the ancient world, roughly contemporary with ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, and in some ways more sophisticated than either. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had grid-planned streets, standardized brick sizes, sophisticated drainage systems, and a writing script that we still cannot read. At its peak around 2000 BC, it may have had a population of 5 million. For decades, the leading theory about Mohenjo-Daro's end involved the famous skeletons. Excavators found scattered human remains in what looked like sudden death positions in the streets. People who appeared to have been ended without being buried. This was cited as evidence of a massacre, possibly the Aryan invasion proposed in early 20th century scholarship. More recent analysis has substantially dismantled this narrative. The skeletons date to different periods. They weren't all ended at the same time. Many show evidence of natural death rather than violence. The massacre interpretation was built on assumptions that the physical evidence doesn't actually support. What really happened to the Indus Valley civilization is that it declined gradually over several centuries, starting around 1900 BCE, with populations apparently moving east and south. The leading current theory involves climate change, specifically a weakening of the monsoon that made the region drier, stressing the agricultural base. Trade with Mesopotamia, documented in cuneiform records, dropped off. The script disappeared. The largest Bronze Age civilization west of China just deflated. No invasion, no conquest, no massacre. Climate changed, agriculture became harder, cities were gradually abandoned, people moved. The writing died with them, and we've never decoded it. Story 13, Petra and the Nabateans. They built a city in a rock face, controlled the ancient world's trade routes, and then basically vanished. The Nabateans are one of those civilizations that archaeology keeps having to revise upward in its assessment of. Originally described as desert nomads who happened to carve impressive facades in the sandstone cliffs of southern Jordan, they turn out to have been sophisticated hydraulic engineers, long-distance traders, and the people whose alphabet directly gave rise to the Arabic script still used by hundreds of millions of people today. Petra, their capital, is the rock-cut city that everyone's seen in photographs. The treasury, carved into a canyon wall, approached through a narrow slot canyon. The treasury is a facade. Behind it is an empty chamber. Most of Petra wasn't carved into rock. It was a regular city of buildings, markets, and houses that have mostly eroded or been buried. What survives is the rock-cut monumental architecture, because sandstone doesn't decay like mud brick. The Nabateans controlled the incense trade routes from Arabia to the Mediterranean for centuries. Frankincense, myrrh, and other goods that the ancient world burned in enormous quantities for religious purposes. They became wealthy enough to build one of the ancient world's more impressive cities in one of the ancient world's more inhospitable environments. Rome eventually absorbed them. The Nabatean kingdom became the Roman province of Arabia Petraea in 106 C. Trade routes shifted when sea routes to India became more practical than overland caravan routes. Then, a massive earthquake in 363 damaged the water systems. Petra was essentially lost to the wider world for over 1,000 years, known only to local Bedouin, until the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt talked his way in, disguised as an Arab, in 1812. The city they built to control desert trade still stands. The trade routes are gone. Story 14: The Nok Culture. West Africa had sophisticated terracotta art and early ironworking 2,500 years ago, and almost nobody studies it in 1943. Tin miners in northern Nigeria accidentally dug up a terracotta head of extraordinary craftsmanship. It was eventually identified as part of a culture now called the Nok, a society that flourished across what is now central Nigeria from roughly 1500 BC to 500 C. Producing sophisticated terracotta sculptures of human figures, animals, and decorative objects that represent some of the oldest known figurative sculpture in sub-Saharan Africa. The sculptures are remarkable. Nok terracotta figures have distinctive stylized features, triangular eyes, elaborate hairstyles, detailed body adornment that are consistent across a wide geographic area and a long time period, suggesting a coherent artistic tradition rather than isolated local production. These people were making sophisticated representational art, while Rome was still a cluster of villages. They also appear to have been among the earliest iron workers in West Africa, possibly developing iron smelting independently rather than importing the technology from North Africa. If that's accurate, it positions them at one of the most important technological transitions in African history. We know almost nothing about their social structure, their religion, their political organization, or what they called themselves. We have no written records. The terracotta figures weren't found in context. Many were discovered in disturbed alluvial deposits by tin miners who weren't documenting stratigraphy. The culture's end around 500 C is essentially unexplained. The Nok existed across a territory roughly the size of the UK for 2,000 years, producing some of the finest sculpture of the ancient world, and the academic literature on them is a fraction of what exists for far less significant Mediterranean cultures. The disproportion says something about which ancient histories have been prioritized. Story 15: Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. The stonework is so precise that engineers still argue about how they did it on the Altiplano of Bolivia, at an elevation of about 12,500 feet above sea level, high enough that altitude sickness is a real concern for visitors. The civilization of Tiwanaku built structures between roughly 300 and 1,000 C that still generate genuine engineering debate, not alien theory debate. Actual peer-reviewed engineering debate about exactly what techniques, tools, and organizational systems would have been required to produce what's there. The site called Pumapunku is the specifically puzzling part. It contains large H-shaped stone blocks, some weighing over 130 tons, that are cut with geometric precision, right angles, smooth surfaces, interlocking shapes that fit together without mortar. The precision of the cuts suggests either very sophisticated stoneworking tools or extremely refined techniques using harder materials than the softer sandstone being cut. The blocks were quarried from sites 10 to 90 kilometers away and transported to the site. Some of the heaviest ones are from a quarry on the other side of Lake Titicaca, which would have required lake transport. The logistics of moving multi-ton stones across a plateau and across a lake using Andean Bronze Age technology are impressive by any standard. Tiwanaku peaked around 800–900 C, with a population estimated in the hundreds of thousands, then collapsed rapidly around 1000 C. The collapse is attributed to a prolonged drought that disrupted the raised field agriculture system that the civilization ran on the Altiplano. A climate reconstruction from ice cores supports this. The stonework is still there, still precise, still generating papers. The people who made it were gone within a generation of the drought. Story 16: The Wari Empire. The Inca had a predecessor that ran most of Peru, and we barely know anything about it. Everyone knows the Inca. The Inca Empire, the roads, Machu Picchu, the Quipu, the extraordinary administrative organization that ran the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. The Inca are extensively documented in their own oral traditions, in Spanish colonial records, and in archaeology. The Wari are not extensively documented. They ran a substantial empire across the Andes between roughly 600 and 1000 C, predating the Inca by several centuries. And many of the things that make the Inca impressive turn out to have Wari precedents. The road system that the Inca are famous for? The Wari were building roads, the administrative centers that controlled the empire's provinces. The Wari were building those. The Quipu, the knotted string recording system, associated with the Wari before the Inca. The Wari appear to have been the origin of many of the institutional technologies that the Inca later developed and expanded. They were running a proto-Inca administrative state for 4 centuries. Their collapse around 1000 CE is not well understood. The main Wari city, Huari, in the Ayacucho region of Peru, was apparently abandoned, but the mechanism isn't established. Climate stress has been proposed. Internal political fragmentation is possible. The Inca remembered the Wari only vaguely, or chose not to emphasize their precedent. Spanish colonizers focused on recording Inca history and institution. The result is that we know far more about the last empire than about the people who invented what the last empire ran on. Story 17: The Hopewell Mound Builders. Ancient Ohio had a continental trade network and built lunar observation complexes from roughly 100 BC to 500 C. The Ohio River Valley was the center of something extraordinary. The Hopewell culture, named for a farm where early mounds were excavated, not a term the people themselves used, built enormous earthwork complexes of geometric precision: circles, squares, octagons, and connecting avenues covering areas measured in square miles. Their largest earthwork complex, Newark Earthworks in Ohio, originally enclosed 4 square miles. The octagonal earthwork at Newark is aligned with the lunar standstill cycle, an 18.6-year cycle in which the moon's rising and setting points reach their extreme positions on the horizon. The alignment is precise enough that archaeoastronomers consider it intentional. These people were tracking long astronomical cycles and encoding them in landscape-scale earthworks. The trade network is equally impressive. Hopewell burial mounds contain obsidian from Yellowstone, mica from North Carolina, copper from Lake Superior, shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, and grizzly bear teeth from the Rocky Mountains. This was a trade network that spanned most of North America, funneling exotic materials to Ohio for use in mortuary rituals. Then, around 500 C, the distinctive Hopewell cultural pattern faded. No more exotic long-distance trade goods. No more large geometric earthworks. The population didn't disappear. People continued living in the region, but the specific cultural complex, the trade network, the earthwork construction, ended. Why? Climate change has been proposed. Social disruption, the introduction of bow and arrow technology changing warfare dynamics. Nobody has a clean answer. The earthworks survive. The Newark Octagon is now a golf course. The lunar alignments still work. Story 18: Who got to the Americas first? Footprints in New Mexico just broke a theory that had been settled for decades for most of the 20th century. The academic consensus on when humans first arrived in the Americas was relatively settled. The Clovis people, around 13,000 years ago, crossing from Siberia to Alaska during the last glacial maximum when sea levels were low enough to expose a land bridge. The Clovis first hypothesis was backed by distinctive stone tool technology found at multiple sites and was the accepted model. Then, white sands happened. In 2021, researchers published dating results for fossilized human footprints found at White Sands National Park in New Mexico. The footprints were dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, about 8 to 10,000 years before Clovis. If those dates are right, and they've been challenged and re-examined, humans were in New Mexico during the last glacial maximum, at a time when the standard land bridge entry route was largely blocked by ice sheets. Which means either the dating is wrong, the entry route was different, or the whole timeline of human arrival in the Americas needs to be rethought. The dating has been questioned because the seeds used to date the footprints may have incorporated old carbon from the lake environment, potentially making them appear older than they are. A follow-up study found grasses and pollen in the same layer consistent with the radiocarbon dates, but the debate hasn't closed. Pre-Clovis sites have been accumulating for years. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, Monte Verde in Chile, and each one has been debated. The White Sands footprints are the most dramatic challenge yet. The first Americans may have been here much longer than anyone thought. Story 19: The Liangzhu Culture. Ancient China had a sophisticated civilization that was completely erased from memory until archaeology found it. Here's a genuinely remarkable thing. A civilization that built massive water management infrastructure, produced extraordinarily refined jade objects, and ran a complex society across a large area of what is now eastern China, and was so thoroughly forgotten that Chinese historical records contain essentially no memory of it until 20th century archaeologists started digging. The Liangzhu culture flourished around 3300–2300 BC in the Yangtze River Delta region. Their jade working is astonishing. Ritual objects of extraordinary precision and refinement, including the distinctive Kong and Bai that show up across a huge geographic area and likely had significant ritual meaning. The precision of the carving was achieved with tools that Liangzhu craftspeople had, which is impressive enough to have generated genuine debate about how it was done. Their water management system is arguably their most impressive achievement. The ancient Liangzhu Dam complex, discovered and confirmed relatively recently, represents the earliest known water management infrastructure in East Asia, predating comparable Chinese imperial engineering by over 1,000 years. Then, around 2300 BCA, the Liangzhu culture abruptly collapsed. The archaeological signature is consistent with catastrophic flooding, layers of clay consistent with flood deposition, followed by an absence of the characteristic Liangzhu material culture. Climate records support a period of intense rainfall around this time. The people who came after, the early Chinese civilizations of the Bronze Age, apparently had no memory of what had come before. The Liangzhu weren't mythologists. They weren't incorporated into legend. They were simply forgotten, buried under flood deposits and the passage of time, until archaeologists found them. Story 20: The Xia Dynasty. China's legendary first dynasty might be real history or might be pure myth. And the debate is still live. Chinese historical tradition holds that civilization began with a series of sage kings, and then the three dynasties: Xia, Shang, and Zhou. The Shang dynasty has been confirmed archaeologically. We have oracle bones with inscriptions, we have the cities, we have the material culture. The Zhou is thoroughly documented, but the Xia, the first dynasty, the one that supposedly came before Shang, is another story. The traditional account places the Xia dynasty from roughly 2070 to 1600 BC. The founder, Yu the Great, is credited with controlling the floods that threatened early Chinese civilization, a founding myth of hydraulic engineering mastery. Later Chinese histories include detailed Xia king lists and accounts of Xia institutions. What archaeology has found: the Erlitou culture in the Yellow River region, dating to roughly 1900–1500 BCE, is a sophisticated Bronze Age culture with palace complexes, bronze casting, and the organization of a state-level society. Many Chinese archaeologists identify Erlitou as the archaeological correlate of the Xia. The site shows evidence of the kind of early urban complexity that the historical accounts describe. What archaeology hasn't found: writing from the Xia period that refers to itself as Xia, or any contemporaneous external reference that confirms the historical account. The Shang oracle bones mention the Shang dynasty and its kings. No comparable confirmation exists for Xia. This is the same debate as was Troy real? A question of whether a detailed traditional account reflects genuine historical memory or is later myth-making. The site exists. The civilization existed. Whether the people who lived there called themselves Xia and had the institutions the historical tradition describes is still open. Story 21: The Green Sahara. An entire chapter of African civilization is buried under sand, and we can't get to it between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago. The Sahara was not a desert. The African humid period, driven by shifts in Earth's orbital cycles that intensified the monsoon, turned what is now the world's largest hot desert into a landscape of lakes, rivers, grasslands, and forests. Hippos lived in what is now Libya. Elephants roamed what is now Algeria. Rock art from this period shows cattle herding, swimming, hunting wildlife that has no business being in a desert. And there were people. A lot of them. The Green Sahara supported substantial human populations across what is now an essentially uninhabitable wasteland. The settlements, the cultures, the trade networks of Green Sahara peoples are almost entirely unknown to us. Why? Because they're buried. The drying of the Sahara, which happened relatively rapidly starting around 5,500 years ago, covered everything under sand. The settlements are there. The material culture is there. But it's under meters of sand dunes across millions of square kilometers of territory that's both extremely difficult to access and largely unsurveyed. Satellite imagery has revealed tantalizing traces: ancient lake beds, dried riverbeds, potential settlement locations. Occasional survey expeditions have confirmed human occupation across areas now considered uninhabitable. The DNA of modern African populations carries genetic signatures that are starting to reveal migration patterns from the Green Sahara period. An entire chapter of human prehistory, possibly several chapters, is sitting under the Sahara right now. The people who lived there before the desert came, the cultures they built, the interactions between them, we have almost none of it. The sand is doing a better job of preserving the secret than any government classification system ever could. Story 22: The Vinca culture. Neolithic Balkans may have invented writing before the Sumerians, or they may have invented something else entirely. The Vinca culture of the Balkans, centered in present-day Serbia but extending across a significant chunk of southeastern Europe, was one of the most sophisticated Neolithic cultures in Europe, flourishing between roughly 5,700 and 4,500 BCE. They had large settlements, sophisticated pottery, metalworking, and trade networks, and they produced something that has been generating controversy ever since archaeologists noticed it: the Vinca symbols. Carved and painted onto pottery, figurines, and spindle whorls across the Vinca cultural area, the symbols are a collection of marks, geometric shapes, lines, crosses, spirals that appear with sufficient regularity to suggest they weren't random decoration. The same symbols appear repeatedly at different sites across a wide geographic area. Some researchers have argued this constitutes a writing system, potentially predating Sumerian cuneiform by 1,000 years. The Tartaria tablets, 3 clay tablets found in a Vinca culture context in Romania, bearing symbols similar to early Mesopotamian writing, became the focus of this debate. If the Tartaria tablets are genuine Vinca artifacts from around 5300 BC, they would represent the oldest writing in the world. If they are, as some argue, intrusive artifacts from a later period or even planted, the whole argument collapses. The core dispute: are the Vinca symbols a writing system, a systematic method of encoding language, or are they something else, like religious symbols, ownership marks, or craft codes that were meaningful but didn't encode speech? Specialists are genuinely divided. The symbols don't connect to any known later writing system, which either means the tradition died completely or means it was never writing in the first place. The debate has been going for 60 years. No resolution is close. Story 23 Ubar. The Atlantis of the Sands was called a myth until satellite imagery found it in the middle of the desert. Ancient texts across multiple traditions, the Quran, the work of medieval Arab geographers, Lawrence of Arabia's accounts, referenced a legendary Arabian city called Ubar, Iram of the Pillars, or various other names, a great city of immense wealth, built in the desert, eventually swallowed by the sand as divine punishment for its inhabitants' transgressions. For centuries, scholars classified it as myth, the Arabian version of Atlantis, a moral fable rather than a historical place. In 1992, a team led by filmmaker Nicholas Clapp and explorer Ronald Fiennes used Landsat satellite imagery and data from the space shuttle to analyze the Arabian Peninsula's subsurface, looking for ancient caravan tracks that would be invisible from the ground but detectable from space. The ancient tracks converged at a single point in what is now the Dhofar region of Oman. They excavated the site. What they found was a substantial fortified structure dating to between 3000 BC and approximately 300 C, sitting at what had been a crucial waypoint on the ancient frankincense trade route. The site was surrounded by a large sinkhole. The city had literally collapsed into an underground cavern, the soft limestone underneath giving way under the weight of centuries. The collapse is what the legend preserved. A city that sank into the desert, swallowed by the earth, accurately described in a tradition maintained for over 1,000 years before the physical location was identified. The real Ubar was not as grand as the legend made it. No city of immense towers and legendary wealth. A fortified way station on a trade route that fell into a hole. The legend made it bigger. The reality is still remarkable. Story 24 South Korea's sealed royal tombs. The government deliberately won't excavate them, and entire dynasties' histories sit unopened. This one is unusual, because the mystery isn't that we can't find the evidence, it's that the evidence is right there, known to be there, and the decision has been made not to look at it. The Silla and Baekje kingdoms of ancient Korea, which flourished roughly between the 1st century BC and the 7th century CE, built elaborate burial tombs for their royalty. The Silla tombs in particular, concentrated around the city of Gyeongju, are large earthen mounds that have been known and respected for centuries. A few have been excavated and produced extraordinary finds: gold crowns, glass objects, and trade goods showing connections across Asia. Most haven't been touched. The South Korean government's policy has been to leave the majority of major royal tombs unexcavated, primarily for conservation reasons. The argument is that excavation technology continues to improve, and that waiting for better methods will produce better results and less destruction of fragile organic materials that current techniques can't adequately preserve. This is a defensible policy. It is also a policy that means entire chapters of Korean dynastic history, the burial practices, the belief systems, the material culture of specific rulers are sitting in mounds in a modern city, visited by tourists every day and deliberately unread. The tombs are not hidden. You can visit Gyeongju and walk around them. The contents are inside. The knowledge is in there. The decision is to wait. And so entire histories remain underground in a city that millions of people visit specifically to see ancient Korea. Story 25 Nalanda. The ancient world's greatest university burned for months, and we don't know what was lost for over 700 years, from roughly the 5th century to the 12th century CE. Nalanda, in what is now the Indian state of Bihar, was the most important center of Buddhist learning in the world. At its peak, It may have housed around 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. Scholars came from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia. The subjects taught included theology, logic, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. It was a functioning university of extraordinary scope and prestige, centuries before European universities existed. Its library, reportedly called Dharmaganja, the Ocean of Knowledge, was said to occupy 3 large buildings, one of them 9 stories tall. The scale of the collection reflected the institution's centuries of operation and its position as a center of manuscript production and exchange. In approximately 1193 C, forces under the Turkic commander Bakhtiar Khilji destroyed Nalanda. The accounts of what happened to the library are consistent. It burned. The books, manuscripts, texts accumulated over centuries, burned for months. What was lost is unknowable. Buddhist texts, certainly, but also works of medicine, mathematics, logic, and philosophy from traditions that may not have had copies elsewhere. Works in languages whose other manuscripts may not have survived. The intellectual heritage of 1,000 years of scholarship at the most important learning center in Asia. We have no catalog of what Nalanda held. We know some of what was there because scholars who studied there wrote about it, or because Chinese pilgrims like Xuanzang documented the library. The gap, the texts that were unique to Nalanda, that existed only there and burned in 1193, is permanently unknowable. What we lost we can't name, because the only record of it was in what burned. Story 26, the Toltec problem. The Aztecs' legendary Golden Age ancestors might be mostly Aztec myth. The Aztecs were very clear about where their civilization came from, the Toltec. In Aztec historical tradition, the Toltec were a great people who had built a Golden Age city called Tollan, who had mastered arts and agriculture, who had been ruled by the legendary king god Quetzalcoatl, and from whom all legitimate ruling lineages derived. To be Toltec, or to claim Toltec descent, was to be prestigious in the Aztec world. The archaeological site that corresponds to the Toltec is Tula, in the Mexican state of Hidalgo, which was a substantial city between roughly 900 and 1150 C. Tula has impressive remains, large pyramids, warrior columns, evidence of a significant urban center. Archaeology confirms it as a real place, with real history. The problem: Tula doesn't match Aztec descriptions of Tollan very well. Aztec texts describe Tollan as having palaces of jade and gold, corn that grew in multiple colors, inexhaustible abundance. Tula was a real, but not particularly exceptional Mesoamerican city. The gap between the archaeological site and the legendary capital is too big to bridge with normal embellishment. This has led some scholars to question how much of Toltec history as transmitted through Aztec sources is accurate historical memory versus later Aztec myth-making, essentially. The Aztecs may have constructed a prestigious legendary ancestry that was partially real and partially invented to legitimize their own political order. The Toltec existed. Tula was their city. Whether the golden Tollan of Aztec tradition was real, or whether the Aztecs built a magnificent predecessor out of a more modest reality, is still genuinely debated. Story 27, the land of Punt. Ancient Egypt traded with this kingdom for centuries, and we've never found it for about 1,500 years. From the Old Kingdom period through to the New Kingdom, ancient Egyptians wrote about, painted, and traded with a place they called Punt. They called it Ta-Necher, the land of the god. It was a source of the things Egypt valued most: gold, ebony, myrrh trees, frankincense, exotic animals including baboons and leopards, electrum, and other luxury goods. Expeditions to Punt were major state enterprises, commemorated on temple walls. The most famous, under Queen Hatshepsut around 1470 BC, is depicted in extraordinary detail at Deir el-Bahri. Here's the problem. We have never found Punt. We don't know where it was. The Egyptian sources give us directional information. Punt was reached by sea, apparently to the south or southeast. The goods traded there are consistent with the Horn of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, or somewhere along the East African coast. The animals, baboons, the specific species depicted in Egyptian paintings have been analyzed genetically and match populations from the Eritrea, Ethiopia, to Djibouti region. Myrrh trees of the species depicted grow in that area, but somewhere in East Africa or the Arabian Peninsula is a large area, and no archaeological site has been identified that clearly represents the kingdom Egyptians were trading with for 15 centuries. The Egyptians drew their trading partners and described their buildings, but the descriptions are idealized rather than specific. The actual state, its cities, its political organization, nothing is confirmed. Egypt's most important long-term trading partner for over 1,000 years is completely unidentified in the archaeological record. Punt is ancient Egypt's own lost civilization. Story 28, the Elamite civilization, one of the world's oldest cultures, totally unrelated to any other known language, still not fully understood while scholars spend enormous effort on ancient Mesopotamia, Sumer, Babylon, Assyria. Right next door, in what is now southwestern Iran, was a civilization just as old and arguably just as significant: Elam. Elamite civilization was flourishing by at least 3200 BC, contemporary with the earliest Sumerian city-states. The two civilizations traded, competed, fought, and influenced each other continuously for nearly 3,000 years. The Elamite language is a complete isolate. It is not related to Sumerian. It is not related to Semitic languages like Akkadian, Aramaic, or Arabic. It is not related to Indo-European languages. It is not related to anything. No known language in the world is demonstrably related to Elamite, which means either that all related languages died out, or that Elamite developed in total linguistic isolation from all other traditions, or that we simply haven't found the relatives yet. We can read Elamite. It was written in cuneiform, which we understand. The script is deciphered. The grammar is partially understood. Some vocabulary is established. But the language has enough unusual features and enough gaps in our understanding that many Elamite texts remain only partially comprehensible. The Elamite civilization was eventually absorbed into the Persian Empire. Susa, the Elamite capital, became a major Persian royal city. Persian reliefs show Elamite officials in the Persian court, but the culture was absorbed and the language died. The last Elamite texts date to around 400 BC, contemporary with the oldest writing in the world, related to no other known language, partly understood and partly opaque. Elam remains one of the most understudied major ancient civilizations. Story 29, the Kingdom of Saba, biblical Sheba, is one of those places that straddles the line between history and legend. In the Hebrew Bible, the Queen of Sheba visits Solomon with gifts of gold, spices, and gems. In Ethiopian tradition, the Solomonic dynasty claims descent from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. In the Quran, the story appears in detail: a queen of a prosperous southern Arabian kingdom visiting the great king of Israel, whether historical or legendary, has been part of the religious imagination of half the world for millennia. The actual kingdom of Saba was real. Archaeological work in Yemen and the surrounding region has confirmed a sophisticated South Arabian civilization that controlled the frankincense and myrrh trade routes from roughly 1000 BCE to 300 C. They built the Great Marib Dam, an ancient engineering achievement that irrigated thousands of hectares of otherwise dry land and supported a substantial population for centuries. The dam's eventual failure, around 570 C, is commemorated in the Quran as the consequence of the people's ingratitude. The specific details of Saba's history, its political structure, its religious practices, and its eventual absorption into later South Arabian kingdoms, much of this is reconstructed from inscriptions, from external references in Egyptian, Assyrian, and later Greek texts, and from what archaeology has recovered. What archaeology might still recover, what inscriptions and structures remain unexcavated in Yemen, is now largely inaccessible. The ongoing conflict in Yemen has made archaeological work essentially impossible since 2015. and some known sites have been damaged or destroyed in the fighting. A civilization that controlled the ancient incense trade for 1,000 years is now inaccessible because of a modern war. Story 30. Angkor, the world's largest pre-industrial city, ran on a water system that catastrophically failed at its peak in the 12th century CE. Angkor, the capital of the Khmer Empire in what is now Cambodia, was the largest pre-industrial urban settlement in the world by area. The city, dedicated to the Hindu and later Buddhist cosmology of successive Khmer kings, was centered on a series of state temples of increasing grandeur, culminating in Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever built, and later the Face Tower Temple complex of Angkor Thom. The entire city ran on an extraordinarily complex hydraulic system, a network of reservoirs, canals, and dikes that managed water across a flat landscape with dramatic wet and dry seasons. The system collected monsoon rainfall and stored it for use during the dry season, allowing year-round rice cultivation across a huge area. The largest reservoir, the West Baray, is still filled with water today. Managing water was what made Angkor work. The Khmer Empire declined, and the city was effectively abandoned by the 15th century. For generations, the explanation was military. Thai kingdoms from the west repeatedly attacked Angkor, but researchers who have studied the hydraulic system in detail now propose that the water management infrastructure catastrophically failed during a period of extreme climate variability in the 14th-15th centuries. A period of severe drought alternating with intense monsoons that overwhelmed a system calibrated for more predictable conditions. The hydraulic system, sediment analysis from the reservoirs, and climate reconstruction from tree rings in the region all point toward a system breakdown. The Thai military pressure may have been the final push, but the underlying infrastructure was already failing. The temples are still there. The hydraulic system still exists in part. What made it all work stopped working. Story 31. Vinland, the Norse found North America, stayed for a few years, and left, and nobody agrees on why L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, is the only confirmed Viking Age site in North America. The excavation in the 1960s found unmistakably Norse material: a Norse-style longhouse, worked iron nails, a bronze cloak pin of Norse type, in a context dated to around 1000 CE. The Norse saga's accounts of Vinland, the land west of Greenland, were confirmed as referring to a real place where real Norse people had actually been. They didn't stay. Archaeological evidence suggests the settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows was occupied for only a few years. The Norse sagas describe multiple expeditions and at least one attempted colony, but the colonization failed and Vinland was abandoned. 500 years before Columbus, Norse explorers had found North America and decided not to keep it. The sagas give various reasons: conflict with the indigenous people, the difficulty of defending a settlement so far from Greenland, internal disputes among the colonizers. The population of Greenland, the Norse base for North American exploration, was small, maybe a few thousand people, and couldn't sustain a significant colonizing effort against organized local resistance. What's genuinely debated among historians is how serious the Norse attempt to colonize was, and why exactly it failed when it did. The conventional explanation, too far, too few colonists, too much local resistance, is plausible but underspecified. The Norse maintained contact with Greenland for centuries after abandoning Vinland. They clearly could reach North America. They chose not to try again. 500 years later, when European colonization of the Americas began in earnest, the Norse attempt had been forgotten in Europe. What might have happened differently if they hadn't given up is one of history's more interesting counterfactuals. Story 32. The Denisovans, an entire branch of ancient humanity known entirely from a few bone fragments and a tooth in 2008. Archaeologists excavating Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia found a small bone fragment, a fingertip bone, that appeared to be hominin. They sent it for DNA analysis. What they got back was neither modern human nor Neanderthal DNA. It was something else, a distinct population of ancient humans that had never been identified before, that we had no prior knowledge of, that wasn't in any fossil record anyone had connected to this group. The Denisovans, named for the cave where the only physical remains have been found, are known from a handful of fossils, the finger bone, 3 teeth, and a few other fragments. From these fragments, researchers have extracted ancient Dina and reconstructed a significant amount of the Denisovan genome. What the genome tells us is extraordinary. Denisovans interbred with modern humans. People of Melanesian and Aboriginal Australian descent carry approximately 3–5% Denisovan ancestry. Tibetan populations carry a version of the EPAS1 gene associated with altitude adaptation that came from Denisovans, a genetic inheritance from interbreeding that helps Tibetans live at high altitude without the physiological problems that affect most people. The Denisovan contribution to modern human genetics is real and functional. What we don't know: what Denisovans looked like. A 2019 reconstruction based on which parts of their genome regulate development produced a tentative picture, but we have no skull, no skeleton, no artist's rendering that's genuinely reliable. We don't know how they lived, how they organized their society, what languages they spoke, or what happened to them. An entire branch of humanity, present in Ardna, known almost entirely from a cave in Siberia. Story 33: The Red Deer Cave People. Archaic-looking humans were living in southern China until surprisingly recently, in the caves of Yunnan province in southern China. Archaeologists found human remains that initially seemed to be from the deep past. They had features that looked archaic, more similar to early Homo sapiens or even pre-modern human species than to the anatomically modern humans who had supposedly been dominant in Asia for tens of thousands of years. Then they dated them. The Red Deer Cave People, named for the deer bones found with them, which they apparently cooked, were living in southern China until approximately 14,500 years ago. That's not the deep past. 14,500 years ago is the end of the last ice age, a period when modern humans were widespread across Asia, when cave paintings were being made in Europe, when the first settlements of what would become civilization were beginning. This means an archaic-looking hominin population survived in southern China until very recently in geological terms, potentially overlapping with fully modern humans in the region. The classification debate is ongoing and heated. Some researchers argue the Red Deer Cave People represent a distinct archaic human population that survived in isolation in southern China, perhaps a late surviving relative of earlier hominin populations in the region. Others argue they were modern humans with unusual physical characteristics, possibly a distinct ancient population that was within the range of modern human variation. The ambiguity comes from the preservation state of the remains and from the genuine challenge of distinguishing archaic morphology from unusual modern variation. Ancient DNA, which would settle the question, hasn't been successfully extracted from the Red Deer Cave material. We may have had archaic human cousins in southern China until 14,500 years ago, or we may have had an unusual modern population. The distinction matters enormously and hasn't been resolved. Story 34: The Sumerian King List. Ancient records list pre-flood kings ruling for tens of thousands of years each. Then suddenly normal lifespans. The Sumerian King List is one of the most fascinating ancient documents in existence. A list of kings of Sumer, who ruled, and for how long. Compiled originally around 2100 BC and preserved in multiple copies, it starts from when kingship descended from heaven and works forward through history. The pre-flood kings on the list reigned for extraordinary lengths of time. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. His successor for 36,000 years. 8 kings in total are listed before the flood, with reigns ranging from 18,600 to 43,200 years. Total reign time before the flood, 241,200 years. Then the flood. Then kingship descends again from heaven. And the post-flood kings have normal human lifespans. The first post-flood dynasty has kings reigning for hundreds of years. Then the reigns get shorter, and by the historical period we can independently verify. The list matches archaeological and other historical evidence reasonably well. Historians and Assyriologists have been interpreting this document for decades. The dominant view is that the pre-flood kings, with impossibly long reigns, represent mythologist legendary rulers, a way of encoding the immense antiquity of Sumerian civilization in narrative form, while the post-flood section gradually transitions from legend to historical record. Some have noted that the specific numbers for pre-flood reigns correspond to cycles in Babylonian astronomical mathematics, suggesting the numbers may be symbolically meaningful rather than chronological. The flood itself appears in other Mesopotamian texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atra-Hasis epic, as a historical boundary event. The transition from 43,200-year reigns to human-scale ones at the moment of a flood is one of antiquity's more interesting numerical puzzles. Story 35, the Cycladic figurines. Thousands of these elegant marble sculptures exist and nobody knows what they were, for in the Bronze Age Aegean, the islands of the Cyclades, from roughly 3200 to 2000 BC, a distinctive culture produced marble figurines of striking elegance. The Cycladic figurines are abstract, flattened, with stylized features, arms folded across the body, faces without eyes or mouth, heads tilted slightly back. They range from a few centimeters to over a meter tall. They're in virtually every major art museum in the world. Modern artists, Brancusi, Moore, Picasso, have cited them as influences. They look startlingly contemporary, and we have almost no idea what they were for. The figurines are found primarily in graves, which suggests a funerary function. Objects placed with the dead to accompany them or represent them or serve them in the afterlife. But they've also been found in settlements, suggesting they had uses among the living as well. Some show traces of pigment. They were painted, probably with elaborate patterns that are now lost, which suggests they were meant to be looked at, possibly in ways that their current stripped marble museum presentation doesn't capture. The Cycladic culture left no writing, no contemporary textual descriptions of what these objects meant, who was depicted in them, what rituals they participated in. The figurines are all we have, plus a few other categories of material culture. We're reading an elaborate visual language with no dictionary. The figure's pose, arms folded, face tilted slightly upward, is consistent across thousands of objects over 1,000 years. That consistency suggests meaning, a specific representation of something specific. What that something is, we cannot say. Story 36, Dvaravati, a Buddhist kingdom in Thailand that flourished for centuries and left almost no historical record between roughly the 6th and 11th centuries say. A Mon-speaking Buddhist kingdom called Dvaravati dominated what is now central Thailand. It produced distinctive Buddhist art, stone dharmachakras, distinctive Buddha images, terracotta, architectural decoration that influenced Buddhist visual culture across mainland Southeast Asia for centuries. Its influence can be traced in Cambodian Khmer art, in Burmese Buddhist imagery, in later Thai religious iconography. For a kingdom that lasted 5 centuries and had this level of cultural reach, the historical documentation is startlingly thin. The name Dvaravati appears in Chinese travelers' accounts and in 1 or 2 inscriptions. We don't have a king list. We don't have a capital city definitively identified. We don't have a clear account of how the kingdom was structured politically, how it fell, or what exactly replaced it. It seems to have declined around the 11th century, possibly absorbed by or replaced by the Khmer Empire expanding westward, possibly transformed into later Mon polities. The transition isn't well documented. The Mon people who carried Dvaravati culture are still present in parts of Myanmar and Thailand. Their language, now spoken by a relatively small population, is one of the oldest documented languages in Southeast Asia. But the kingdom that represented the height of their political and cultural achievement is known mostly through its art, a few inscriptions, and the accounts of people who passed through rather than those who lived there. 5 centuries of a kingdom that shaped Buddhist art across a region, known mostly from what it left in stone. Story 37, the Sea Peoples. After the Bronze Age collapse, they changed history and then basically disappeared from the record. The Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian records of the late Bronze Age as terrifying raiders who came from the sea and contributed to the collapse of the interconnected Bronze Age world around 1200 BCE. Egyptian relief carvings at Medinet Habu show Pharaoh Ramesses III defeating them in naval and land battles. The Sea Peoples are depicted with distinctive feathered headdresses, reed ships, and weapons. They are credited with destroying the Hittite Empire, destabilizing the Levant, and attacking Egypt itself. And then what? Where did they go? The evidence suggests they settled. The Peliset, one of the named Sea Peoples groups, are generally identified with the Philistines, who appear in the archaeological record of Canaan shortly after the Bronze Age collapse, with distinct material culture showing Aegean origins that gradually blended with local Canaanite culture over generations. Ancient Dina from Philistine burial sites has confirmed Aegean ancestry consistent with migration from the Greek world, but the Peliset are only one group. The other named Sea Peoples, the Checker, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshish, don't have equally clear archaeological successors. Some of them may be identified with later peoples in the Levant or Anatolia, but the identifications are debated. The majority of the Sea Peoples, these groups who swept across the Bronze Age Mediterranean and helped end an entire civilizational era, settle into anonymity in the archaeological record within a generation or two. They came from somewhere, went somewhere, and became other peoples so thoroughly that identifying exactly who became what is still a live research question. The feathered headdresses are in the Egyptian relief. The people who wore them dissolved into history. Story 38, the Longshan culture's disappearance. The sophisticated Neolithic society, right before Chinese civilization transforms around 1900 B across the Yellow River Basin in coastal eastern China. The Longshan culture represents some of the most advanced Neolithic society in East Asia before the emergence of the historical dynasties. Longshan potters produced eggshell thin black pottery, so thin it's nearly translucent in places, using wheel techniques of extraordinary refinement. Their settlements show evidence of social stratification: elite burials with jade objects and special goods, commoner burials with less. They built walled settlements, suggesting both the organization to coordinate large construction and the perceived need to defend against something. Then, around 1900 BC, the Longshan cultural pattern gives way to the Erlitou culture, which may or may not be the Xia dynasty, and eventually to the Shang. The transition happens differently in different regions, and the mechanism isn't uniform. What happened? The debate runs between two broad poles. Internal evolution. The Longshan cultures gradually developed into more complex forms, with the emergence of the first states representing a transformation of the same population rather than a replacement. Or population disruption. Climate evidence shows periods of significant flooding in the Yellow River Basin around this time, and there's some evidence of settlement abandonment that could reflect population displacement. The eggshell pottery stops. The settlement patterns change. The ritual objects shift from Longshan types to the jade and bronze forms associated with early Chinese dynasties. Whether the people who made the eggshell pottery were the ancestors of the Shang kings, or whether they were displaced and replaced, is something archaeologists are still arguing. The pottery is extraordinary. The people who made it remain in partial shadow. Story 39, the Bahia culture. Coastal Ecuador had pre-Columbian contact with Mesoamerica, and we've barely studied them along the coast of Ecuador in what archaeologists call the regional development period. Several sophisticated cultures flourished: the Bahia, the Jamacahuaque, the La Tolida, and others. They produced sophisticated ceramics, including distinctive figurines, had elaborate burial practices, and occupied a stretch of Pacific coastline that was in contact with distant trading partners. How distant? Among the Bahia culture's material remains, archaeologists have found objects and cultural influences that suggest contact with Mesoamerican societies, possibly the cultures of Western Mexico. Certain figurine types, certain pottery forms, certain cultural practices appear in both areas in ways that are harder to explain by independent invention than by some form of long-distance contact. The argument isn't settled, but it's been made seriously by researchers who have studied both areas. The Ecuadorian coast is also the place where, in 1975, anthropologist Betty Meggers proposed that Japanese Jomon pottery found in Ecuador represented trans-Pacific contact around 3000 BC, a proposal that remains highly controversial but hasn't been definitively refuted. What makes the coastal Ecuadorian cultures a particularly frustrating mystery is how little they've been studied relative to their apparent importance. They sit on a Pacific coast that may have been a conduit for long-distance contact. Their material culture is sophisticated. Their influence on later Andean traditions is real. But compared to the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, the archaeological attention paid to these cultures is minimal. We know these cultures existed. We know they were connected to something larger. The specifics are buried in a coastal region that hasn't received the excavation attention it probably deserves. Story 40, what lost civilizations are actually about, why these mysteries matter, and what they're telling us. We've been through 39 lost civilizations. Norte Chico, running a complex society apparently without warfare. The Beaker people replacing Britain's population in a few generations. An entire Green Sahara civilization buried under sand. South Korean royal tombs deliberately left unexcavated. Nalanda's library burning for months. The Etruscans' language we can read but not understand. A cave in Siberia producing DNA evidence of an entire branch of humanity nobody knew existed. Cycladic figurines in every art museum in the world, with no documentation of what they were for. The specific thing all of these have in common is that they're holes in the story we tell about human history. History, as most people learn it, runs from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece to Rome to medieval Europe to the modern world, with everything else as backdrop. The civilizations on this list are the ones that don't fit that story, the ones that were doing extraordinary things before the timeline we emphasize, or in places the dominant narrative ignores, or in ways that complicate the assumption that progress has a single path. Norte Chico challenges the assumption that complexity requires coercion. The Denisovans challenge the assumption that Homo sapiens is the only human story. The White Sands footprints challenge the timeline of when people got to the Americas. The Rapa Nui ecocide revision challenges the assumption that indigenous populations destroyed themselves. The Nok culture challenges the assumption that West Africa was peripheral to ancient history. The holes in the story are where the actual complexity of human history lives. The things we don't know, the civilizations we haven't adequately studied, the histories buried under sand or locked in unexcavated tombs or encoded in writing systems we haven't decoded. These aren't just gaps. They're reminders that the story we tell about the human past is partial, and that the parts we're missing might be the most interesting ones. The lost civilizations aren't lost. They're waiting.